English is odd in that it is inflected for gender only in the third person singular. Now, Turkish, for example, is not inflected for gender. There's one pronoun, o, for he, she, it. So you don't have this problem in Turkish when you are referring to a character in a story who's not present. We had this problem for in English for inflection for marital status, which was true for females and not males. Mr. was Mr., but Miss and Mrs. gave you more information. So there was a one-time backwards incompatible change that got made with Ms. And it still rankles because it doesn't sound great, but I think it was a good idea to give women the equality that they deserved and shouldn't have to ask for. Okay, if you wanted to actually do the pronoun thing for English, would you start with trans or would you start with intersex? Now, if you started with intersex, everyone is intellectually sympathetic with intersex. There are people whose gender or whose sex is ambiguous, right? Because of the way in which development sort of takes female and turns it into male if the SRY protein is present. So this,
everyone who understands this, just to be clear, not everyone who hears about this, but everyone who has...
In general, no matter how conservative somebody is, if I tell them there's a person born with ambiguous genitalia, or they've got an SRY protein on an X chromosome, or they have a malfunctioning one on a Y so that they appear to be the opposite phenotype for their genotype, there's compassion. This person was born, a soul was born without the expected assignment. And there's no question about development and should we be steering, you should be more male, you should be more masculine, more feminine, in order to avoid like the sky-high suicidal temptations for people who feel that they are one thing while evidencing that they are something else in the physical. Okay, you would make the change based on intersex. You'd make a one-time backwards incompatible change to the language with a pronoun like Turkish has. And then trans would have what it wanted without this craziness of everybody gets to design their own personal pronoun, which is a disaster. Like in a computer science course, you would never allow people, you'd give them a choice so that the coding can go through. Everybody can't have their own pronoun, right? And so that's how you do it. And if you wanted it to win, that's how you'd push it through. Now, what they want is something else. They want to say something like, trans women are no less women than women who are born biologically female. Well, that's not true, right? I understand it is the case that every single culture, every traditional culture of which I'm aware, there is gender ambiguity. In South Sulawesi, you have a priestly class from it. In India, you have the hijras. Turkey's national treasure, Zeki Müren, was more feminine than Liberace. I just came from Italy, where in the Uffizi Gallery, there's an entire room called the Hermaphrodite Room, dedicated to a beautiful statue of an ostensibly female recumbent model with male genitalia. There is, the Shah, not the Shah of Iran, the Ayatollah in Iran came out with a proclamation that it was okay to have gender reassignment surgery. So it's not like traditional cultures don't know about this. It's not like we haven't made accommodations. It's always been an issue, whether it's the Katuis in Thailand, which are among the best spoken and most educated people that you meet as a traveler. The issue is that we somehow wanted to make a wedge issue out of this. I am going to force you to say things that aren't true as an evidence of my power, as opposed to...
Well, that's exactly why I opposed the legislation in Canada to begin with, because part and parcel, what came along with that as part and parcel of it, and this was no accident, was a legal insistence that gender differences were socioculturally constructed. It's like, well, they're not. And I thought, well, what the hell? Why are we enshrining that viewpoint into law? I mean, that's not to say that gender doesn't vary, gender expression doesn't vary substantially because of sociocultural conditions, because you have to be a fool not to see that that's the case. But that's another situation where the multidimensional complexity seems to exceed the processing capacity of the ideologues, is that there's more than one factor at work.
No, they know what they're doing. Like, for example, should a skirt be seen as feminine or masculine? Well, we know from India, where the lungi is popular, for Scotland, where there's a kilt, that this is a variable. In other words, you shouldn't hard code skirts are for girls, right? And so the idea is that there's a huge developmental aspect to learning, here are the assignments in your culture. Now, at some point, you want to steer people into, we have a huge interest in the breeding family as the core of lineage in a society. And we need to care both about gays, about people of uncertain gender, non-binary people, et cetera. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we also have to care about the breeding family in distress.
And we also have to provide people with an easy pathway to a reasonably stable identity, to not confuse them to death.
But this is the point, is that they have an argument that I think we are learning that gender discomfort is far more common than we ever thought, although far less prevalent than the discussion seems to suggest. You do have a societal interest in steering people to roles if it's possible. But once somebody is like committedly non-binary, a switch has to flip on us, and we have to become compassionate and recognize that we have a soul that we have to take care of. And we do have to make some allowances. If you know anybody who's intersex, for example, you know that it's a terrifying state, that they face violence. I mean, why don't you see dudes kissing? I always claim that it's the implied threat of violence, where if it makes people uncomfortable, you don't see people holding hands quite so comfortably, and you don't see people being themselves. So if we, for example, in the IDW stood up for intersex and say, this is the right way to do what you're doing, I think it would be an absolute service to the world, because that's something we could push through. I don't think that the conservative Christians in this country are going to have a die-hard, they're going to feel like, well, if the Lord made people in that way, we have to accept all the products of God's creation.
Where do you fall on that? Because this is where people will say, well, Jordan's against trans people and gay people. I mean, all the nonsense that I hear about you.
The situation in Canada was quite clear, is that the federal government, following the provincial governments, decided that it was okay to impose requirements for the regulation of speech. And I didn't care what the reason for that was. I thought that it was a terrible legislative move. And partly not because it wasn't only compelled speech. I read the policy guidelines that were the framework within which this bill was to be interpreted. There's pages and pages of them, all on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, which was linked to the federal website, where they had announced how this bill would be interpreted. And it contained all sorts of terrible things, like the insistence that gender was a socio-cultural construct. And it's in part a sociocultural construct.
Great.
And these things you cannot do that, because all of a sudden the legislation seemed to imply that a discussion about the biological differences between men and women might be regarded as hate speech. And I also think we're a fair ways along that pathway in Canada. So I don't think that my fears about the bill were unwarranted, and I think that what happened at Wilfrid Laurier University is an absolutely perfect example of that. So I think that my stance on that piece of legislation was substantively correct. Now, the problem is that, or the treachery that was involved in the bill, because I see the bill as an attempt by the radical left to gain linguistic dominance over, increasing linguistic dominance over the conversation as a whole, using trans people as the sacrificial victims. And by the way, I got no shortage of letters from trans people saying, I'm not so happy being used as a sacrificial victim for the left to advance its linguistic hegemony. I got a lot more letters like that from trans people than I did from trans people criticizing what I did. So, and I also think that this would have all died away very rapidly if all it was about was one professor's objection to the rights of trans people. That had very little to do with it.
Let's just take this bull by the horns right now. Am I correct, and you and I have not discussed this, that your point would be that law is the wrong place to do it, and that culture would be the right place to do it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
and this has to be bottom up, like the Ms. thing was.
I understand that. So my point is,
law is absolutely the wrong place to do this.
So then why not let it come from us? I mean, in other words, this thing has been so crazily interpreted by the press. This is absolute malpractice, as far as I'm concerned, by our journal. This is journogenic malpractice. Okay.
Well, I should speak up for some of the journalists in Canada, because the Post Media Group, there's 200 newspapers, came out in support of my stance. So there are journalists who aren't doing that.
But my point is that the fact that we're still having to discuss this is a tax on all kinds of discussion. The more time I have to spend saying I'm not alt-right, you know,
transphobic.
I don't want to
bigoted,
talk about the
racist.
fact that I'm in an interracial marriage because I oppose these, you know, equity proposals that are complete abominations.
Right.
Remember when you and I were in Tempe, Arizona, at the comedy club, and I said something like, you know, we shouldn't be celebrating this. I'm in an interracial marriage, and everybody trained seals is clapping. I said, stop it. I said, unless a few of you are admissions officers to Ivy League schools, in which case I'll talk to you later. But the point is,
I know it's a terrible thing to take
applaud,
credit for that.
Right? It's like you happen to fall in love with a person of color.
That's not a moral victory on your part.
Is there a medal, you know, in your future? You don't want it. Now, what I'm trying to say is something slightly different, which is, I want in on the positive aspects of the social transformation. I know that my intersex people are hurting, and I know that trans people are present in every culture without the social justice stuff. And we should be spearheading what the incompetent progressive left can't get done.
Well, so is that what we're doing?
Well, it's one of the things that I want to be doing. Like, you know, gay marriage turned on a dime over a very short period of time, like smoking, right? Somehow there's no smoking in bars. It's almost incredible, you know, if you're old enough to think about that. We should be spearheading this thing because they can't get the job done. And what is our point? Not in law.
Yeah, not in law.
But do it in culture. You can't have everybody do his or her own pronouns, which is an absolute disaster. But we could settle on, you know, and you could do he and they, you know, pronouns or something like this. I don't know what the right thing. Get a linguist to figure out the minimally intrusive, one-time backwards incompatible change to the language. It's going to be painful. I'm not looking forward to it, but we could get it done.